just get my mouse pad. Oh, perfect.
Whatever you do.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the intermission. My name is Nikita Rubocki. I'm going to start this with saying I'm still a little nasally from a whole bout of sickness I had 3 weeks ago. So if I have to blow my nose or cough, I promise it's just me and not you. That being said, my name is Nikita Rubocki. Like mentioned, I work for Uptech Studio. We are based out of California, but we do have an office here in Bend. We're a small company of 15 or so people, and we do mostly software consulting plus. Work with a lot of early stage people, a lot of startups, anywhere from 0 users to I think our biggest client right now is 10,000 plus. So kind of in that space. We help augment teams that need more assistance, might need certain levels of expertise. Some things we just build entirely from scratch. Some of the projects I'm in right now, we're actually just implementing the analytics for teams. So they've already built the thing, but they need help implementing Braze or Amplitude, Segment, Mixed Panel, if you've ever heard of any of those. But basically just, how do you measure the health of your app? That being said, I'm here today to talk about my journey in this space. I've been working for them for almost 2 years to the day. It was my first real job out of college. So I'm a little fresh, a little green, probably compared to some of the folks in the audience. But I first gave this presentation for a group of college students at OSU Cascades, and there were a couple of professors in the audience, such as Bijou over here. So this is going to be a repeat, rinse and repeat for him. But there were just a couple people who have been in this space for a few decades who came up to me after and were like, hey, some of the things you talked about were actually super useful and super interesting. And so I figured I would take this to this varied group where I'm assuming there's going to be people of all experience levels. So at any point, if you want to interject, please feel free to ask me questions. It's not going to get super technical, so you shouldn't have any questions. There's one line of code, but I'm pretty sure most people in this room can handle the one line you will see. And then, other than that, yeah, just raise a hand if something comes up. Otherwise, we can chat at the end. It should only be about 20 minutes, half an hour, depending on how long I ramble in the story section. But that being said, let's embark on a journey. So just a quick little overview. I hope you brought your USB walking sticks and your sense of adventure, because we are going on a harrowing journey through the land of software development today. First, we're going to sail across the ocean of expectations and learn how to find our North Star when starting some projects. Then we're going to hike through the simple software plains, find some, find some new ways to tackle projects and ideas. Swimming circles in Iteration Lake is going to teach us the beauty of process. We're going to meander through Mistake Meadow and learn how to tackle our mistakes with some humility. And then finally, we're going to scale the rocky sides of Mount Deployment, where dangers and treasures alike will lead us. Come on. There we go. So one of the biggest and most consistent things I find in the 2 years I've been doing this now is that in any development work, and arguably life in general, is you are going to run into the ocean of expectations. Software development is an ever-changing discipline, and it can often feel like you're drowning in just the sheer number of languages, stacks, infrastructures. Especially at my company, we're constantly looking for the newest, latest things, right? How can we get stuff to people faster, cheaper, at still a high quality, right? Without having to go spin up an AWS server farm for a single founder, right? And so, not to mention, with all those decisions, again, in my line of work, you have the client expectation, right? And again, we're working with people who took out a loan, just dropped their job, might have taken trying to pay back friends, family. How do we get them real investment dollars and get them on their feet in this new project, without drowning ourselves? So the whole thing can be very overwhelming, is the TLDL of it. So how do you navigate it all? Like I said, seems like there's just never-ending list of stuff, never-ending task lists, and the problem is with the client, they expect things to be done quickly. They might not have the full technical expertise to understand why this takes so long, or why we need to go down this archaic rabbit hole, or what the heck tech debt is and how to pay it off, right? And so these opposing forces can be hard to reconcile in the day-to-day of this job. Again, this is compounded by the fact that software is a very unstable landscape. You've got your, when you're starting off on a new project, you've got your tried and true, like big behemoths, AWS, Azure. There's all these new, like lightweight, fast, promising things out there now. If you've ever heard of like Supabase, we've got Heroku out there, Nitric, right? All these things. And then not to mention, there's new stuff coming out every single day, right? Is it worth adopting? Is it worth going through the learning curve? And how do you even like know whether to make that decision or not? So with all of these options and all of these consequences for the path you choose, what is a simple developer to do? Especially when you're starting a new project with a client and you're supposed to be like, the excellent, the expert, the engineer, right? So this is an age-old question. I'm sure everyone has run up into this at some point in their job, whether it's tech-related or not. And although it's not inherent to software, I do feel like software feels it a little more keenly just because of its rapid iterative nature, right? Like it tends to change more than like architecture or something's gonna change. So this leads us to our first major discovery on our journey, the developer dogma, all in caps because it's always true, and that is that the software is always going to change. The requirements are going to change, the architecture will change, the design will change, the dependencies will change, sometimes on like a daily basis. I mean, every time I run like npm update, it's like, oh, there's new stuff that's already out of date, even though I just did this yesterday, right? So on and so forth. Fill in any noun you want with that, it's going to change. So my advice to this, at this point, and something I've had to learn in the 2 years I've been in this like rapid landscape, is to get super comfortable with this concept, right? There's a difference I've found, especially being like the youngest in my company and working with a lot of people who have been doing this, like I said, for like a couple decades. They started Uptech because they've been doing it for decades and wanted to do it the quote unquote right way, right? But there's still a difference between experience and assumptions, right? Are you holding fast to something because experience and your gut is telling you, oh, this is the right path? Or are you holding fast to assumptions because you're comfortable in this tech stack, you've done it a bunch of times, it's too hard to change, it's too hard of a learning curve and that type of thing. I find that those are two different opposing forces, and it's a fine line to walk, but the difference can mean, the difference in whether you can get something out the door in a week or get something out in like half a year, right? So I know all of this to start sounded pretty demoralizing. I promise this picks up. Because who in their right mind is going to subscribe to this, right? We will, but that's okay. But if you never know what you're creating, and you never know if your creating is going to change or if it's going to be the right decision, how do you make good software that's going to meet or exceed your client expectations? Now, I don't have an answer right off the bat, but we've landed on the shore of our simple software planes. And so with that question in mind, let's continue our journey. So again, another one of the biggest lessons I've learned in like my real development years is the danger of over-optimizing too quickly, right? Something I like to quote often is this line by Sandy Metz, which is in its short version here, but the longer version goes more of, I would rather have duplicate code in the wrong design than optimized code in the wrong abstraction, right? I think, and as we all know, it is so incredibly easy to introduce complexity into software. That's like every developer who's ever had to hop into a system, make a system, go into a legacy system, you just like look at it and you're like, how did this go so wrong, right? How often, for instance, and I think, backing up, I think this is just a problem with human nature itself, right? Like how often do you find yourself, I'm just gonna like go clean out my closet, and then like hours later there's like stuff strewn, you found like some trophy from high school you haven't seen in ages, like some piece of clothing from like the 80s, you're like, I don't even know where this came from, some night in Vegas, right? And it turns into this bigger project. Or you are like, hey, I've got like this fun little like DIY project, it's just gonna be a Saturday afternoon, right? And then weeks go by, you've gone multiple trips to Lowe's, and you're like, it's still not actually done, like, whoops, like, I'm sorry if I'm bringing PTSD up for anyone, but we've all been there, right? Thank you, like, we got some laughs, like, you feel that inside, right? And so I think that software succumbs to that exact same fate, right? The human nature of leading to this unmanageable complexity where you start with the best of intentions and it just spirals. So what do you do about it? And what can we use to, combat these issues? So exploring this concept a little further, a little more concretely, when adding a new feature to an existing system, after you go through all the bells and whistles of talking with the client, the designer, the PM, et cetera, right? I find that at the end of the day, you usually come down to one of two options. Unless you're just like the perfect developer and it just perfectly fits in the system and builds, and then in that case, like, you know, you should be working at Google making millions. But that's not me. I run into issues all the time. New stuff comes in, how does it fit into the existing system? Chances are it doesn't always quite fit, but you can see, like, you know, just a little if statement here, or a new field on an object, or a new variable in a method, and like it will work, right? Like it will go, and just like a slight adjustment, and it's fine. And that might be fine for the short term, right? In my line of work, we often call these the special snowflake cases, right? You just build out your little edge case, and you know, you move on, your whole system happy, right? However, like snowflakes, people often say that you can't find the same one twice, or it's impossible to find the same one twice, and the same thing applies to your software system. If you're seeing a bunch of snowflakes happening in the same part of your code base, it probably means that it's no longer a special edge case, but the abstraction needs to be changed, and the underlying abstraction you started with is outdated and has outgrown its usefulness, right? So, in that case, what do? One of the things that I like to do is duplicate it. And I know duplication is so bad, right? I just told you that this change is going to be hard, and now I'm telling you that later you're going to have to make that change in 2 places, 3 places, 4 places, right? Now you're just multiplying your change across. And I get that, right? I totally agree. If you're doing duplication the wrong way, you're just like quite literally exponentially increasing your mess, right? You have to make one change, suddenly that field is changing across your entire code base. However, I like to say that duplication within reason can actually be a good way to optimize that code base. As we learned earlier, the software is always going to change. And unfortunately, it's impossible to know all of that up front, right? We run into this all the time. You get a client, they have this great idea in their head, and then you present them with the thing they told you, and they're like, that is absolutely not what I meant at all, right? But that's what they told you. So how do you reconcile those things where it's impossible to know what they're actually going to want when it hits the real life and they can have it in their hands? So what I like to do is start with just a bit of duplication, right? Instead of going through and making all these classes and these methods and these services. Again, if you're experienced and you've been doing it for a while and you're like, this is just a basic API and this tech stack I'm familiar, I know I'm going to need X, Y, Z. To a degree, that's probably true. But in some cases, I would like to challenge and say, hey, what if like on this new thing, we just duplicate it instead of like deciding this is what the abstraction is before we really know? And then, almost like magic, with enough of those duplications, you're going to start to see where the similarities are. And those similarities are going to naturally expose themselves as the right abstraction. And then you can pull out the abstraction, clean up your duplication, refactor, and you will be set with the right thing instead of, again, like we said, the wrong abstraction in that design.
You also have the advantage if they decide they don't want the feature, it's easy to throw away.
Exactly, right? I always, we were talking a bit about Jan Bakos in my earlier conversation. One of the things he taught us originally when I was going through my classes is we would do like the greenest implementation possible, which like as engineers, as brilliant people, were like, but it can be so much cooler and better and smarter. But I remember we just had one where it was like print the lyrics to a song, and everyone was making these methods and these parsers, and it was literally, the goal of it was just copy, paste, print, right? Which is horrible, like it makes you cringe, it's just a block of paragraph. But like that was the easiest implementation, and if it never changed, it would work, right? And so that's kind of what like this idea is getting at. So thank you for that. And to that degree, and kind of what I just said, we've discovered some remedies to this code rot and to battle this complexity. So when you're adding code into the system, look to see if the change is easy. If it is, just make that change. Done, right? However, if you're pushing too hard, right, kind of like square into the circle hole and it's not quite fitting and it's getting more complicated and you can't quite write the test to get it to run, then it's probably time to figure out what the new abstraction is. A little bit of duplication, a little bit of letting that abstraction come out of the system. And that way I think programming is like an art, right? Like if you let it, it will come to you. So instead of putting in the new feature immediately, with that new feature in mind, update the system, pull out the abstraction, and then you will suddenly find that we're back to the other one. The change is suddenly easy to make. So the point here is not that it's like one or the other, right? Again, it's that constant push and pull between like new all the time, and then like, I want to pay off the tech debt, I want it to be perfect. But rather, these things go hand in hand. If the change is easy, do that. If it's not, make the abstraction. Rinse, repeat as necessary. Now, come on. Speaking of the repetition, we've arrived at iteration lake. So we've learned so far, software is always changing, and we have one tool to potentially combat that complexity. However, there's more to software than just building the software itself, right? You gotta work with design, you gotta build the thing, you gotta get it out into the world. How do you manage all of that complexity? Again, if it's constantly changing, and if it's constantly changing, it's never quite done, right? Where do you draw that line and start putting stuff out into the world? So I'm going to follow that question with another question, which is what is the best way to cross a lake where you can't even see the other side, right? The answer would be one stroke at a time. Software is the exact same way. I mentioned at the beginning, our running task list feels infinite, and a lot of times it usually is. However, the tasks themselves making up those lists are very finite, right? You can break the task down until it's manageable, testable, and can have like a clean, done, this is the finish line. If the problem does not have a clean finish line or it's not testable, break it down further until you hit that point, right? Complexity is the death of speed. To accomplish anything, you gotta learn how to break it down. And there's like a million paradigms, you've heard it all, agile, extreme programming, do 2 weeks, do the tickets, do the sprint. And however you wanna spin it, the basis is always the same, right? Take a problem, break it down until it's manageable, and then iterate on that. In my company, we tend to do, on the internal project I'm on right now, we have like a consistent build release every other week. We have a Jira board that breaks things down into epics, which could be like a month or two. Epics are full of stories, which are more like a couple weeks, and then stories are full of features, which are days, right? And so by breaking all of those problems down, we have something that might not be done for a couple months, but in progress of that goal, you can check off one little thing at a time. So not only does this guarantee that we're going to have a consistent release, a consistent new stuff for users, but it also just keeps team morale up, right? Because people hate having lingering to-dos, and people love crossing off a ticket and saying, that's out in the world now, right? So, like most things in life, when the problem feels too big, break it down into its smaller pieces. So after finishing our swim, we notice another new tool for our tool belt, which is the deployment rope. By following these steps and iterating on them in short loops, again, if you or your company applies one of the paradigms, that's okay, but all of it comes down to basically, right, design it, build it, test it, repeat. And keep breaking it down until you can do this. At that point, you will take that infinite thing off into the distance and make concrete steps towards the progress. So now we get to Mistake Meadow, because despite our best efforts and me on my pedestal saying all the great ways to write software, you're going to make mistakes, right? You can try to write the most beautiful, clean, perfect looped code that you can, and there's always going to be something that comes up. We're all human, and therefore all inherently flawed, and so the software we make the exact same way. Unfortunately, I don't have any magical tools for that. Instead, I figured we've been journeying for a bit now, so we're going to sit by the campfire, and I'll tell you a couple stories from my experience at work where this has come in. One of the more famous stories at my company is the infamous teapot error. The partners who started Uptech Studio, a lot of them used to work for Acorns. If you've ever seen it, like the little stock app, right, you can get started with just like $5, right? So a lot of them used to work for Acorns, and Acorns is like pretty big, right? Like even when they were there, it's pretty big, a lot of users, a lot of publicity. And they were on the dev team, and they were building out, a new service, and they're building out the air handling for it, and they came to an error case that was impossible to hit, right? And I can see, on your faces, you can probably know where this is going. Could never ever be hit. They tossed in like just a little funny like developer joke. They're like, this is going to be the teapot error, right? I don't know why teapot, but they tossed it in there. And then, you know, forget about it. Weeks later, you push it to production, and then suddenly, to thousands of users, they're getting a push notification, and all it says is teapot error. Yes, correct. So this impossible, never could be hit error is suddenly being broadcast to like thousands of their users, right? Because some service somewhere had gone down, didn't get the right credentials it needed, and so was tossing this error out, right? Someone forgot to like spin up the thing it actually required. So that's like a very good example. Personal example, like about a month ago, we were implementing, the project I'm working on requires like an event stream, right? So we were implementing a new version of this event stream in Amazon called Kinesis, and basically we're just spinning up some lambdas to grab the events in the batches that they come in, process them, put them into our databases, right? And me and another developer who were working on this, we had it all set up, it was mostly working, we were running test batches of events of 1,000, and we kept only getting like 500 to 600, right? Like consistently. It was never the same number, but it was always like in that range. And we were like, why, like where are these events going, right? Like we combed through everything in that system, line by line, added all the logging, error handling, like out the wazoo, right? Just like so many logs, so many things, kept running this test over and over, and just could not find these missing events. Like they were just nowhere to be found. It was the point where we had spent like, not like full weeks, but like a lot of time over multiple weeks, like trying to figure this out. And to the point where we were like about to call Amazon services, like upgrade our tier to get the support level. And then as like a final thing, I was going through like one more time, just adding like literally every log you could think of, just like line by line. And I find that our for loop, which is supposed to be processing the batch, right, every event in the batch, has a return statement in it. So the loop is only going once for every batch of events, right, which is why we're not missing, thank you, yes. So it's why, in this code,
I've never done that.
Never, right, yeah.
First time.
Every return statement, perfectly where it belongs. No, so this literally the whole thing, weeks and weeks of work and logs and errors, was one little return statement.
Is this an indentation thing in Python?
No, we're actually in TypeScript, so it was literally just like a, we didn't even need a return statement because it was a void function. So like the whole thing was unnecessary to begin with, but it was just cutting the loop off. So like most of the events would go through, but it wasn't actually batching. So those are just a couple fun stories from my time. I'm sure at the end, if anyone has ones they want to share, we can do that. But the point is that's going to happen, right? Mistakes will be made, and yet we will live to tell the tale. So nestled among the coals the next morning, we wake up refreshed, bright, lovely. We find a traveling companion with a keen ear. So as we have all heard, as we all know, mistakes are the best place for growth. So though I don't have any remedy for not making the mistake in the first place, I have found a couple questions that I like to ask when they do happen that can help prevent them in the future. The first one being, what caused the error in the first place? Now this seems super simple, but the problem is you need to keep iterating on that question until you find like an actionable item, not just like, hey, Chad over there pushed a commit without approval. And you're like, okay, yeah, dang it, Chad. But okay, like if Chad was able to do that, like why, right? Like do we not have the right hooks in place? Do we not have the right pipeline running the right checks, right? Like do we not have the right permissions, right? Like least privileged permissions, whatever way you want to spin it, right? And that's related to the second question, which is what guardrails can be put in place to prevent it in the future? One of my favorite stories, I can't remember where I heard it, what company, and just probably some article online, but there was a development team that had interns, and on the very first day, for all these interns, they would get used to the dev environment, and they would have them make a commit and push it into their main pipeline, right? Like this big system with like real people using it. And you know, as the story goes, some developer came to like the lead guy who's running all this, and they're like, how are you just having interns like push stuff, right? Like they're green, they don't know anything, what if they break it? And to which this lead developer responds, if an intern can come in and push a commit while supervised that breaks the whole system, then like we haven't done the right job implementing the system, right? Yes, thank you. And I love that story because it puts the onus on the system and the things you can put in place, right? Like humans are fallible and the infrastructure we're putting in is incredibly complicated. So how can you build a system to prevent those things? You know, put the guardrails up on the bowling alley, get those strikes, right? So after that, we're a big testing, we believe in tests at my company, so, are there tests you could put to prevent this thing in the future? That's kind of more for like logical errors, right? If something slips in, can you put a test to prevent it from happening again? And then my fourth and final, that I think is overlooked a lot, but that I have found personally super useful, is should there be better documentation about this in the future? One of the things we do for my current project is we have like, it's an internal one, so a lot of devs are like constantly kind of cycling in and out of it, because when we get like paying clients, we obviously prioritize that than burning money on our internal project. And so people have a lot of the context knowledge, but they're constantly moving in and out of it, right? And because it's a system out in the world, it breaks down sometimes, and the person who knows how to fix it might not be on the project right now, or maybe even they only fixed it like a few months ago, the steps are hazy. And so what we've started doing is keeping a running document of just like problems that you might see in like the K8s clusters or like whatever it is, right? And it's just like quick, short description. Here's the problem, here's the error you're probably seeing, and here's a potential solution, right? Of just like random archaic steps that you would never think to go through by yourself. And that's been a super useful way for one, just even if you're the one who solved it the first time, remembering, because again, it doesn't happen often, but it gives you enough time where it's like, what did I quite do? And then it also enables new developers or developers who haven't been in there for a while to get into it and be able to solve it on their own without having to like go pester someone about it, right? So those are the only things I can give you for mistakes, but I think they're pretty good questions. So now we have finally made it to mount deployment. This is going to be our final hurdle before finding our treasure, right? So putting software out into the world can be a very intimidating act, right? Not only do you have to maintain your code bases, once they're there, you have to maintain the infrastructure, there's like a million different things to worry about, keep going, and you have to make sure your software's up and available. And then the worst thing is, if it's successful, you're gonna have real users, and real users have usually not a lot of patience and a lot of opinions, right? So how do you like manage all of that?
And they do crazy things.
Yeah, like they'll do stuff that you never thought anyone should do in the system, and they will find a way. We've seen it happen time and time again. So, but luckily, we have a couple things in our toolkit now to help us scale our software, put it out into the world. And though I will be the first to say that this is not at all comprehensive, and I'm sure there's plenty of things we can all add to it, I like to think that it is a good way to at least start, right? By knowing the software is going to change and making yourself remain flexible, you can then change the software to the shifting needs of whatever it is, external pressures, the client, internal, whatnot, right? And it will be through proper design and quick, digestible iterations, right? So you're not just like shoving a ton of code out in the world and then being like, oh, you don't know which part broke because there's like 10 features in here, right? More importantly, when you do get stuck, you can lean on your team and your community, because we've all been there when mistakes have been made, and most of us in here still have our jobs, right? If you have a tale where you lost your job, I'd love to hear it, but so far, at least I have not personally been fired or harassed for any of the big mistakes I've made. So with these ideas in mind, you can tame this big, horrible, complicated beast of complexity into a nicer, calmer, more enjoyable even code base, I know. This doesn't mean the software is always going to remain tame, but now we have a couple of tools and maybe just a little bit of magic touch to do it. And here's our one line of code. I told you it wouldn't be scary.
Trigger warning.
I know, trigger warning. This is it though, that's the only line in this whole part. So now with our newfound experience and our amazing dragon taming abilities, we have found our treasure. Value-based software. So by asking the right questions around the important features, by implementing good design and abstraction, by keeping your tasks small, you will be able to deliver software that is good and valuable to your users. Because if it doesn't solve a problem or fix a need or even just, solve an irritation they have, in other words, provide value, then like what is even the point, right? Unless you just want to code in your own little void. But in my opinion, bringing out stuff that people are like, wow, this app like changed the way I viewed this and this is like so much better is like the reason I like to program. So, though a long and demanding journey, it is a rewarding one if you are willing to make the trek. Thank you. I'll open it to questions or stories, or if anyone wants to add anything. I know we're right at half an hour, so I don't want to take away from your time.
That's great. Fantastic.
Sweet. Going once.
I could say that when back in the day, Activision, when we were still shipping stuff on DVDs, the way the defects count went was during development. It was like a few hundred defects, and then we hired all the high schoolers with pizza and soda, and then it was like thousands of defects. They came all so fast, and what you were saying made me think of this because there have been a bunch of times that I've seen something weird happen, and then you try to repro it, and it doesn't repro, and you give up, but you know that you're going to show this to like 1 million people, and if you can only see the defect one time in 10,000, that's a lot of people who are going to see the defect at the end of the day. And so I always wondered with those games that we shipped, because they went out the door with still hundreds of defects that I cannot reproduce.
Yeah, you're like, what happened?
How many of the hundreds of thousands, millions of people that bought the games
Yep.
saw weird stuff happen. But
Well, no one's mobbed you yet, right? So
yeah.
just lynches at the house.
Yeah. I mean, they did say the game was crap.
BBS.
Yeah. It was the crap game was X-Men, the official game.
Oh, nice.
The movie game for X-Men. Yeah.
That's good.
Love it. Yeah.
Who's part of your party as you go on your adventure? Who's part of your crew?
That's a great quote. It's how you communicate together to make it through this landscape is how at least Uptech tends to get software out into the world. And then, I would argue that, like any good video game, there's always those people there to help you on like the side quests and stuff. Because we are such a small company, everyone always knows everyone else. So if there's like a niche problem or someone with more expertise in the domain that might just not be on the project, you always have people you can ask. And then, the greater at large Discord communities like this one, and the various like open source languages and platforms out there where you can just like, even Stack Overflow, although it can get a little aggressive sometimes, but post your stuff and someone somewhere probably has the answer, or is at least willing to like sit in the mud with you while you both figure it out. So yeah, good question.
It sounds like the engineers on your team, are you all specialized, or you kind of do everything?
It's a bit of a mix. So I'm like so junior that when I didn't like have a specialty. I just came out of college and I was like, I've worked for a company a little bit, like I can make a pull request. So they just tossed me into a lane, like into TypeScript and Nest.js more specifically. And I was like, I've never done this before, but like I'll just learn. And that's kind of been my personal journey. Like even as recently as last week, I got put on a project that's only a couple weeks that they're doing like PHP and Laravel. I don't even know how to say it yet. Yeah, but I like literally just learned this framework in like the last 2 working days, and like putting events into their system for them because they're on a crunch deadline and didn't have time to get analytics in. So I wouldn't say I technically have a specialty yet. I also do a lot of Flutter. There are definitely some devs who have been doing this for a while. Like we're a big Flutter company, so we have a couple devs that have been like big Flutter, and like one of them's even giving a talk at like the big Flutter annual Flutter conference in like Peru or something. So we got like a couple of people who kind of have that expertise, a couple of people who do like more like iOS, like a little more iOS, like Swift specialty. But it kind of just depends. Like in general, the expectation is like unless, if there's someone better to do the job, they will do it. But like if there is a new thing, or someone wants to try this, or if like you even have something you want to try, like you're responsible and you can, spin it up, learn it, figure it out, right?
Cool. Yeah, maybe germane to this group, like, do the engineers also do the operations?
Like DevOps stuff?
Do you do the deployments and like, I don't know, are you on call?
Yeah, so yes, it depends on the project. So a lot of clients sometimes, in general will have like their own kind of like infrastructure team or like DevOps team. I'd say the majority of our clients are like that. Like we'll be working like with their DevOps to be like, hey, like we need to provision this, or like we need access to this, or whatever. In the internal project that I've been working on until more recently, like we manage all of that, so I'm like half a DevOps engineer. I do like all our code deployments in AWS and like, you know, provision it to Apple and Google, so you know, we're not the most efficient system by any means. There's definitely like, it's kind of an older architecture, speaking of always changing. But yeah, so I'd say it just depends. I mean, people definitely know like a baseline. I wouldn't say anyone's like, you know, AWS certified expert, you know, engineer, but we did get the gist of it.
I think it's really nice that y'all, it sounds like y'all just kind of pick up what you need to do. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. There's very, I mean, you know, we like have enough where we can kind of like pick if there's like a project that's clearly like bad or not going to work, right? But in general, we tend to be like pretty open, and some of our more recent initiatives are like, again, to like that super, super early stage founder. Like we've got like a low code, no code initiative where it's like, I don't know if anyone's ever played around with like Flutterflow or any of those like kind of low code options, but it's where we basically like have like a super cheap option where you get like a dev who will work part-time to kind of do like the more technical stuff, but it's like it's, you know, it's not like something that's like supposed to scale to enterprise level, but it is enough to be like, hey, investors or pitch competition, like here's a thing and it works, and you could like download it and it's like beta, and then hopefully get them the money to be like, all right, now let's like get a real team, put some real infrastructure behind it, that type of thing. So we've been doing a lot of that more recently.
Cool.
Yep.
Sweet.
Absolutely. Well, I'll just cede the floor. But ping me, or I'm on Discord, chat with me after, I'm around. Thank you.